The stars had always been cold and empty, until humanity decided to fill them with laughter and the sound of children playing. In the year 2487, the human race had been part of the Galactic Concord for nearly 200 years, and in that time they had earned a reputation that confused almost every alien species they encountered. They were not feared as conquerors, and they were not respected as warriors in the traditional sense. Instead, humanity had become known across the stars for something far more unusual. They were known as the galaxy's most devoted parents. It was not a joke, though many species had tried to laugh about it in the beginning. The Drethi, a warrior race with armored hides and jaws that could crush starship plating, had once mocked a human diplomat for carrying a picture of his daughter into a treaty negotiation. That diplomat had smiled and said nothing, and the treaty had been signed in humanity's favor. 3 days later, the Drethi never mocked a human parent again. Every species raised their young in their own way. The Velkari grew their offspring in warm communal pools. The insectoid Zithari deposited larvae into vast nursery hives, where caretaker drones fed and maintained them with cold efficiency. But humans wrapped their bobbies in soft cloth and sang to them in the dark hours of the night. They read stories to children who could barely understand the words. They built entire cities around the idea that a child should feel safe and loved and full of wonder. This was why the GSS Lullaby existed. The Lullaby was not a warship, and it was not a cargo hauler. It was a deep space educational vessel, a school ship that carried 1,200 children of mixed species on an interstellar cultural exchange program. Human teachers and caretakers ran the program, and it had become the most respected institution of learning in the entire conquered species. From dozens of worlds sent applications begging for their young to be enrolled. There were waiting lists that stretched for years. Captain Alara Voss commanded the Lullaby with a style that was equal parts warmth and iron. She was a retired naval officer who had served 30 years in the Terran Defense Armada before trading her admiral's stars for a captain's chair on a school ship. Most people found this confusing. Her former colleagues in the military had asked her why she would leave a career of such prestige for what they called a floating daycare center. Alara had looked at them with those sharp brown eyes of hers and said that protecting 1,200 children was the most important mission the stars had ever offered her. Nobody argued with her twice. She walked the corridors of the Lullaby every morning before the children woke up. She checked the environmental systems to make sure the Velkari water habitats were at the right temperature. She inspected the Drethi play areas to ensure the padding was thick enough for their rough games. She even monitored the humidity levels in the small section, reserved for the handful of Zithari larvae, whose parents had nervously enrolled them in the program. Every child on this ship was hers. That was how she saw it. That was how every human on the crew saw it. The program itself was simple but powerful. Children from different species lived together, learned together, and played together. They studied each other's languages and histories and arts. By the time a child completed a full cycle on the Lullaby, they understood more about the galaxy than most adult diplomats. It was humanity's quiet gift to the stars. Not weapons, not technology, but the idea that if children grew up knowing each other, they would never grow up wanting to destroy each other. The Galactic Concord itself had been founded 3 centuries ago, when the first wave of spacefaring species realized that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. The Concord Charter was a massive document filled with trade regulations and territorial agreements and rules about weapons of mass destruction. But the very first article, Article 0, was different from all the rest. Article 0 was the oldest and most sacred law in the galaxy. It stated that no species shall bring deliberate harm upon the young of another species, and that violation of this article would invoke something called the right of answering. The right of answering was unique in galactic law, because it gave the offended species alone the power to determine the scope of their response. No council vote, no mediation, no limits. Most species considered Article 0 a ceremonial relic, a nice sentiment carved into the founding stone of the Concord Hall, but never meant to be used. It had existed for 300 years, and not once had any species invoked it. What most species did not know, or had conveniently forgotten, was that humanity had been the driving force behind Article 0 when the Concord was being founded. It was the human delegation that had insisted on its inclusion, with a passion that bordered on obsession. The other founding species had found it strange at the time why were these soft, short-lived mammals so fixated on a single law about children. Over the centuries, as species after species interacted with humans, the answer became clear: humans did not merely protect their children the way other species protected their young humans, defined their entire civilization around the concept of childhood. A human would starve so their child could eat. A human would walk into fire to pull a child from the flames. A human would challenge a being 10 times their size if that being looked at a child the wrong way. This was not rational behavior by galactic standards. This was something deeper, something primal, something that pulsed through human DNA like a second heartbeat. The Drethai called it the fury of the soft, the Velkari called it the deep current, whatever its name. Every species that had spent enough time around humans understood one simple truth. You could insult a human, cheat a human, even strike a human, and they might forgive you, but if you harmed a human child, something behind their eyes would change, and whatever looked back at you was not something you wanted to meet. The Zithari Dominion had never understood this. The Zithari were an insectoid imperial species that controlled a vast stretch of space on the fringes of conquered territory. They were powerful, numerous, and deeply arrogant. Their society was built on a rigid caste system, where the overmind and the warrior caste ruled with absolute authority, and the lower castes existed only to serve. They viewed mammalian species as inferior. Too emotional, too soft, too attached to individual lives when the swarm was all that mattered. Their ambassador to the conquered, overmind Sekrath, had made no secret of his contempt for humanity. He called them sentimental weaklings in public addresses. He mocked their attachment to their young as a biological deficiency. He once told a gathering of conquered diplomats that humans were like a species that had never evolved past the nursing stage. The human ambassador at that gathering had simply smiled and said nothing. The Velkari ambassador, sitting next to her, had leaned over and whispered that the human silence should terrify the overmind. Far more than any words, the Zithari diplomat did not understand what she meant. On this particular day, the Lullaby was cruising through the Nurith corridor, a well-established neutral trade route that passed near the border of Zithari space. Captain Voss had made this run dozens of times. Without incident, the corridor was safe, well-patrolled, and protected by Concord Treaty. She was sitting in her command chair, reviewing the next day's lesson plans. The children were going to learn about Drethai poetry, which was surprisingly beautiful for a species that could bench press a ground transport, when her sensor officer spoke up. There was an anomalous signal at the edge of their detection range. Voss frowned and told the officer to run a full scan. The officer's hands moved across the console, and then stopped. His face went pale. He reported that there were ships decloaking, 17 of them in a standard envelopment pattern, and that they were broadcasting Zithari military identification codes. Before Captain Voss could open a channel, before she could send a distress signal, before she could do anything at all, the Lullaby shuddered as a massive disruption web wrapped around the hull. Every system on the ship flickered. The lights in the children's dormitories went dark for 3 terrible seconds before the backup generators kicked in. In those 3 seconds, 1,200 children woke up screaming in the dark. And Captain Alara Voss gripped the arms of her chair so hard that the metal bent under her fingers. The Zithari warships surrounded the Lullaby like a fist closing around a beating heart. Captain Alara Voss had her crew at emergency stations within 90 seconds of the disruption web hitting the hull. She was calm, because she had to be calm, because 1,200 children were listening to the tone of her voice over the intercom system. And if she sounded afraid, then those children would be afraid, and she would not allow that. She would not allow fear to be the thing those kids remembered about this day. the lead Zithari vessel identified itself as the Chithra's Claw, flagship of Warlord Chithrak of the 3rd Swarm Fleet. Chithrak's voice came through the communication channel like the sound of breaking glass, sharp and cold, and full of a contempt that he did not even bother to hide. He informed Captain Voss that her vessel had entered sovereign Zithari space without authorization, and that his fleet would be conducting a full boarding inspection of the ship and its passengers. Voss knew it was a lie. The Nurith Corridor was neutral territory protected by Concord Treaty, and every navigational chart in the galaxy confirmed that the Lullaby was exactly where it was supposed to be. But she also knew that she had 1,200 children on board and 0 weapons that could challenge 17 warships, so she kept her voice steady and told Chithrak that she would cooperate fully with any inspection, and that she only asked that his soldiers remember that this was a school ship carrying children of multiple species. Chithrak did not respond to that request. The boarding parties came through the airlocks 20 minutes later. There were over 200 Zithari soldiers, tall insectoid warriors with chitinous armor plating and blade-like appendages that could cut through steel. They moved through the corridors of the Lullaby like a swarm of predators entering a nest that did not belong to them. The human crew did everything right. They guided children to the interior safe rooms. They sealed bulkheads to create buffer zones between the soldiers and the dormitories. They stood in doorways and corridors with their hands open and visible, showing no weapons and offering no resistance. The teachers held children in their arms and whispered that everything would be okay. For a little while it seemed like it might be. The Zithari soldiers moved through the upper decks without incident, scanning cargo holds and downloading navigation logs. It was aggressive and illegal under Concord law, but it was not violent. Voss watched from the bridge and allowed herself to believe that this would end with a diplomatic protest and nothing more. She was wrong. Warlord Chithrak came aboard the Lullaby personally. He was larger than his soldiers, nearly 3 meters tall with a scarred carapace that spoke of decades of combat. He walked through the corridors of the school ship like he owned it, and everything in it. His compound eyes swept over the colorful murals that the children had painted on the walls, pictures of stars and planets and smiling faces of a dozen different species. And he made a sound that his translator rendered as disgust. He found his way to the main assembly hall where the crew had gathered the older children. A human teacher named David Chen stood at the entrance with his arms spread wide, not blocking the door but making it clear that he was the first thing anyone would have to move through to reach the kids behind him. Chithrak looked at David Chen the way a predator looks at something it does not consider worth eating. He told Chen to step aside. Chen did not move. He said respectfully that these were children, and that they were frightened, and that he was asking the warlord to conduct his inspection elsewhere. Chithrak struck David Chen across the face with one armored limb. The blow sent the teacher crashing into the wall with a sound that made every child in the room scream. Chen slid to the floor with blood running from a gash above his eye, and he still, even then, tried to get back to his feet, tried to put himself between the warlord and the children. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every species in the galaxy. Chithrak ordered his soldiers to discipline the passengers. He said it casually, the way someone might order furniture rearranged. He told his warriors to teach these mammals and their assorted pets what it meant to waste the time of the Zithari Dominion. The soldiers moved into the assembly hall and into the dormitories and into the safe rooms that suddenly were not safe at all. They struck children, they grabbed small bodies and threw them aside like debris. They overturned beds and smashed learning terminals and kicked through the art supplies and the storybooks and the little things that had made this ship a home. A 6-year-old human girl named Mia Okonkwo was trying to hide behind a reading chair when a Zithari soldier seized her by the arm and lifted her off the ground. She screamed, and the soldier shook her, and the snap of her small arm breaking was a sound that would haunt every human who heard the recording for the rest of their lives. The soldier dropped her on the floor like a piece of garbage and moved on. A Velkari child, a small amphibian creature with enormous blue eyes who had been on the lullaby for less than a month, went into physiological shock when a soldier struck the water tank next to him. Cracking the glass and sending water flooding across the floor, the child collapsed, and his gills fluttered weakly as his body began to shut down. A human nurse threw herself over him and screamed for help while Zithari boots stomped past her. It lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes of screaming and crying, and the sound of children begging for it to stop. 47 minutes that were recorded by every internal camera on the lullaby, because Captain Voss had activated the full documentation system. The moment the Zithari boarded, she had known in her gut that a record would be needed. She had not known how terrible that record would be. When it was over, when the soldiers had finished their work and were laughing among themselves in that clicking insectoid way, Warlord Chithrak walked to the bridge to inform Captain Voss that his inspection was complete. Ilara Voss stood up from her command chair. She was not tall, and she was not physically imposing, and she had no weapons and no fleet, and no power at all in that moment. She was a 57-year-old woman with gray in her hair, and bruises on her arms from where a soldier had shoved her aside earlier. But when she looked at Warlord Chithrak, something in her eyes made him stop. She spoke in a voice that was not loud, and was not angry, and was somehow worse than both. She said that he had made the last mistake his lineage would ever make. Chithrak laughed, his officers laughed, the translator rendered the sound faithfully into the recording. His soldiers took the ship's databanks and departed, leaving the battered vessel adrift in the corridor with its disruption web slowly fatting. The moment the Zithari ships were out of range, Captain Voss sent the distress signal. She sent it on every frequency, every channel, every emergency band available. She attached the full unedited footage, all 47 minutes of it, and she addressed it not to the nearest starbase or the conquered headquarters but to Earth. To home. The signal traveled at faster-than-light speeds through relay stations that boosted it across the galaxy within 6 hours. The footage was playing on every screen on every human world, and on every conquered diplomatic channel, and on the personal devices of every galactic leader who had the clearance to receive emergency broadcasts. The galaxy watched. A Velkari diplomat watched a Zithari soldier throw a child across a room, and she broke down weeping at her desk. A Drethai war chief watched the footage in silence, and then put his fist through a stone wall. The Concord's governing AI, the Arbiter, processed the footage and immediately flagged it as a potential Article 0 violation. The first such flag in 300 years of galactic civilization. On Earth, in the great circular chamber of the United Human Parliament, the footage played on a screen 30 meters wide. Every representative watched in absolute silence. There were no gasps, because gasps require surprise. And what every human in that room felt was not surprise, it was something older and darker, and infinitely more dangerous. When the footage ended, the Speaker of the Parliament rose from her chair. She was a woman named Adiz Nwasu, and she had served humanity for 40 years, and she had never once raised her voice in the chamber. She did not raise it now. She spoke a single sentence in a voice that carried to every microphone and every broadcast system, and every alien embassy monitoring the session. She said that humanity invokes Article 0 and claims the right of answering. The chamber did not erupt. No one cheered, no one shouted. There was only silence. The kind of silence that falls before a storm that will reshape the landscape. In the alien embassies surrounding the Parliament building, ambassadors of 40 different species heard those words and understood what they meant. The Velkari ambassador closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for humanity, but for the Zithari. The Drethai ambassador stood at attention and saluted the empty air because he knew what was coming and he wanted to be part of it. A young Keshani diplomatic aide who had only been on Earth for a month turned to his senior ambassador and asked what the right of answering actually meant in practice. The senior ambassador, an old creature with 4 arms and eyes that had seen too much, looked at the aide and said that it meant that humanity would decide the punishment, and that no force in the galaxy could stop them, and that no force in the galaxy would try. The aide asked what the punishment would be. The ambassador said he did not know, and that was what should terrify everyone. Within the hour, the Arbiter, the ancient AI that governed the Conquered's legal framework, processed the invocation and found it valid. It broadcast a message to every system, every station, every ship, and every inhabited world in the galaxy. The message read, "Let all species bear witness. The right of answering has been claimed. The scope shall be determined by humanity. None shall interfere." And across the galaxy, in barracks and bases and shipyards that had been quiet for decades, lights began to turn on. The galaxy had 72 hours to be afraid, and it used every single second of them. In the diplomatic halls of the Conquered, ambassadors who had spent their entire careers managing trade disputes and border disagreements were suddenly confronted with something none of them had trained for. The right of answering had been invoked for the first time in 3 centuries of galactic civilization, and nobody, not even the oldest and wisest species in the Conquered, knew exactly what would happen next. What they did know was that they were afraid. Not afraid of the conflict itself, because wars and skirmishes happened from time to time between conquered species, and they were always contained and managed and resolved through negotiation. They were afraid because the right of answering removed all of those safety mechanisms. The offended species alone determined the scope of the response. No vote, no council, no oversight, no limits. And the offended species was humanity. Within hours of the invocation, every alien intelligence service in the galaxy began pulling their classified files on the human race, not the public files that talked about diplomacy and cultural exchange and educational programs. The other files, the ones that senior diplomats called the quiet records, the ones that every species was required to study before their representatives were allowed to serve in human space. The quiet records contained humanity's real history. A Velkari intelligence analyst sat in her office and read about something called the Second World War, and how 60 million humans had died in a single conflict. Not across a galaxy, but on a single planet. She read about nuclear weapons and how humans had built devices capable of turning entire cities into ash, and then built enough of those devices to destroy their own world several times over. She read about the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, and she had to stop reading because her hands were shaking. A Drethi war scholar reviewed the military history files and found that humans had been fighting wars for their entire recorded existence. Thousands upon thousands of years of continuous armed conflict. They had developed every conceivable method of killing each other, from sharpened sticks to autonomous weapon systems to biological agents that could erase populations at the genetic level, and they had done all of this to themselves. The war scholar closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. Then he opened a communication channel to the Drethi High Command and said 4 words: "Do not oppose them." The most disturbing entry in the quiet records was a simple statistical observation that a Keshani sociologist had compiled 2 centuries ago. The observation noted that in the entirety of human history, across every culture and civilization and era, the single most reliable predictor of total war, the kind of war where one side fights until the other side no longer exists, was a threat to children, not territory, not resources, not ideology. Children. The sociologist had added a personal note at the bottom of the report. It read, "I have studied 400 spacefaring species, and none of them, not one, displays this characteristic to the degree that humans do. I advise all species to treat this information with the gravity it deserves." The Velkari ambassador, whose own child had been aboard the Lullaby during the attack, was the first alien leader to respond to the invocation. She appeared before the Conquered assembly with her skin still pale from stress and her voice still raw from crying, and she declared that the Velkari Star Confederation would place its entire military at humanity's disposal. She said that her child had been hurt on that ship, and that the humans who had cared for her child were the ones who had carried him to safety. While Zithari soldiers laughed, she said that she stood with humanity not because of obligation but because of love. The Drethi were next the most feared warrior species in the galaxy, did not make a public declaration. They sent a single encrypted message directly to the commanding officer of the Terran Defense Armada. The message contained 3 words: "We would follow." Within 48 hours, 11 species had offered military support, 7 more had offered logistical and medical assistance. The Zithari Dominion, which had expected the galaxy to remain neutral or even sympathize with their position, found itself utterly alone. But the most frightening development was not the alliance forming against the Zithari, it was what humanity itself was doing. The Terran Defense Armada began mobilizing. For 200 years, the TDA had been a quiet, almost invisible presence in galactic affairs. Humanity maintained a modest fleet for border patrol and anti-piracy operations, and everyone assumed that was the extent of their military capability. The humans were diplomats and teachers and healers. Why would they need a large military? The answer arrived in the form of 14,000 warships. They came from hidden shipyards buried inside asteroid fields and concealed within gas giant atmospheres. They came from deep space stations that had been marked as decommissioned on every public registry. They came from construction facilities that officially did not exist. Ship after ship after ship, emerging from the dark like predators that had been sleeping with one eye open. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the largest fleet ever assembled in recorded history formed up in Terran home space. 14,000 vessels, ranging from nimble destroyers to massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything the conquered had ever seen. Each ship was advanced and heavily armed and clearly maintained in perfect combat readiness. The Velkari Intelligence Service ran the numbers 3 times because they could not believe the results. The fleet represented a military capability that exceeded the next 5 largest navies in the galaxy. Combined, humanity had been building and maintaining this force in secret for decades, perhaps centuries, while smiling and talking about peace and education and cultural exchange. A Keshani diplomat said it best when he turned to his colleague and whispered that the humans had not been hiding their strength out of deception. They had been hiding it out of mercy. They had known what they were capable of, and they had chosen every single day not to use it. Admiral Joaquin Torres was given overall command of the operation. He was 61 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved from dark stone, and eyes that gave away nothing. He had served in the TDA for 40 years, and he had never fired a weapon in anger, because there had never been a reason to. Now there was a reason. His orders from the United Human Parliament arrived in a sealed document that contained a single paragraph. It read, "The Zithari Dominion has harmed our children. Ensure that no Zithari ever harms anyone's children again. The scope is total. The method is yours." Torres read the orders once, then he called his fleet commanders together and briefed them in a session that lasted less than 30 minutes. There was no debate and no discussion and no hesitation. Every officer in the room had seen the footage from the lullaby. Every officer in the room had children or nieces or nephews or students. They had mentored. Every officer in the room understood exactly what was at stake. Torres then did something that surprised the galaxy. He broadcast an open message to the Zithari Dominion on every available channel. His voice was calm and measured and completely devoid of emotion. He addressed Overmind Sekrath directly and gave the Dominion exactly 1 galactic standard day to comply with the following terms: the immediate surrender of Warlord Chithrak and every soldier who boarded the lullaby, the complete dissolution of the Zithari military, and the unconditional surrender of the Dominion's governing caste. He paused after listing the terms and then added that these were not opening positions for negotiation. He said that the deadline was not flexible and the terms were not adjustable. He said that he was giving this warning as a courtesy, and that it would be the only courtesy the Zethari would receive. Several neutral species immediately attempted to mediate. The Keshani offered to host peace talks. The Aurelian Collective proposed a compromise resolution. The conquered Secretary-General herself contacted Tors and urged restraint. Tors thanked each of them politely and declined every offer. He said that this was not a negotiation and that the right of answering was not subject to mediation. He said it without anger and without malice, and that was what made it so terrifying. He spoke about the potential destruction of an interstellar empire with the same tone a man might use to discuss the weather. Overmind Sekrath responded to Tor's ultimatum with a galaxy-wide broadcast of his own. He stood in the throne chamber of his hive palace, surrounded by his warrior elite, and delivered a speech that was full of contempt and bravado. He called humanity a species of weak and sentimental creatures who mistook emotion for strength. He said that the Zethari swarm numbered in the trillions, and that their fleet would darken the stars. He said that mammals did not frighten the Dominion, and that the swarm did not bow. He finished by saying that if the humans wanted war, the Zethari would give them a war they would never forget. Across the galaxy, species who had studied the quiet records heard Sekrath's speech and felt a deep and terrible pity, not for humanity, but for the Zethari. A Drethai war chief watched the broadcast and shook his massive head, and muttered that the fool had no idea what he had just done. The deadline passed at exactly midnight Galactic Standard Time. Admiral Tors was standing on the bridge of his flagship, the TDS Resolve. When the clock reached 0, he looked at the tactical display showing 14,000 human warships and the allied fleets of 11 species arranged behind them. He looked at the star charts showing the path to Zethari space. Then he gave a single command. He said one word: begin. The Zethari Dominion had spent 3 centuries believing it was the most powerful military force on the fringe of civilized space, and for 3 centuries that belief had never been tested. It was tested now. The Terran Defense Armada entered Zethari space through 3 separate approach vectors, in a coordinated assault that military scholars would study and teach for the next 1,000 years. The main fleet under Admiral Tors drove straight through the Shroud Gate, the heavily fortified entry point to the Zethari core systems, while 2 flanking forces swept wide to cut off retreat routes and isolate Zethari reinforcement lanes. The Zethari had prepared for this. They had assembled their full military strength at the Shroud Gate. 8,000 warships arranged in a dense defensive formation that their admirals called the Swarm Wall. It was an impressive display of raw numbers, and the Zethari command cast believed with absolute confidence that no force in the galaxy could break through it. They were wrong. The Battle of the Shroud Gate began at dawn Galactic Standard Time, and it was not a battle in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a lesson. Human warships did not fight the way the Zethari expected. They did not charge in swarms or rely on overwhelming numbers the way insectoid species naturally assumed all warfare worked. Instead, the Terran fleet operated with a precision that was almost mechanical. Each ship knew its role and its position and its firing arcs, and they moved together like the fingers of a single hand. The Zethari fought bravely. That much could be said for them. Their warriors did not flee, and their captains did not surrender. They threw everything they had at the human fleet with the desperate fury of a species that was beginning to realize it had made a catastrophic mistake. But bravery was not enough. Human weapons technology was generations ahead of anything the Zethari had encountered. Terran rail guns punched through Zethari armor plating like it was paper. Human electronic warfare systems scrambled Zethari communications so thoroughly that individual ships could not coordinate with the vessels next to them. Terran shield technology absorbed hits that would have destroyed any other ship in the galaxy, and the ships behind those shields kept firing with mechanical, relentless accuracy. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it was over, the Zithari had lost 60% of their fleet, nearly 5,000 warships reduced to expanding clouds of debris and frozen atmosphere. The human fleet had lost 4% of its forces. 3 Allied ships had been damaged, but not one had been destroyed. Admiral Torres received the battle report on his bridge. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He read the casualty figures. Human casualties were minimal but not zero, and every name on that list was a person he would carry with him forever. And then he gave the order to advance. The fleet moved deeper into Zithari space. What happened over the next 3 weeks was not a war, it was a systematic dismantling of an empire. Human forces moved from system to system, destroying military installations and disabling defense platforms, and capturing Zithari warships that attempted to resist the speed was extraordinary. Torres had planned this campaign with the same meticulous attention to detail that Captain Voss had used to plan lesson schedules on the Lullaby. And the comparison was not lost on the Galaxy. Both humans had taken something they cared about and executed it with absolute dedication. But it was on the ground where the true nature of humanity's answering became clear, and where the story became something more than a tale of military conquest. When Terran Marines landed on the first Zithari colony world, the civilian population expected extermination. The Zithari understood war as the swarm understood it. Total consumption of the enemy, every last individual, down to the larvae. The idea that a victorious army might show restraint was simply not part of their cultural framework. The Marines moved through Zithari cities in full combat armor with weapons that could level buildings. They cleared military positions with devastating efficiency, taking out command centers and weapons depots and communication hubs with strikes so precise that civilian structures 100 meters away were left untouched. And then they reached the nursery hives. Zithari nursery hives were vast underground complexes where millions of larvae were tended by caretaker drones. They were the most vulnerable and most precious part of Zithari civilization. The future of the species, helpless and dependent, lying in warm gel chambers waiting to grow into the next generation. The Marine company that reached the first nursery hive stopped at the entrance. Their commander, a woman named Sergeant Major Diane Akafer, looked at her squad and reminded them of their rules of engagement. Then she holstered her weapon and walked inside. The caretaker drones panicked. They had never seen an alien before, and certainly not one in powered armor that could crush them with a single step. They clustered around the larvae chambers, spreading their bodies over the gel pods in a desperate attempt to shield the young with their own lives. Sergeant Major Akafer knelt down. She moved slowly and carefully. She reached into her pack and pulled out a ration kit and a medical scanner. She placed the ration kit on the ground in front of the nearest caretaker drone, and then she scanned the larvae chambers to check for any health issues. The caretaker drone stared at her with its compound eyes for a very long time. Then, slowly, it moved aside. The Marines did not touch the larvae. They posted guards at the nursery entrance, guards whose job was not to keep the Zithari in, but to keep the fighting out. They delivered food and water and medical supplies to every civilian area. They captured a field hospital, was established in one captured city, specifically to treat Zithari wounded, soldiers and civilians alike. The image that defined the war, the image that would be reproduced in history books and carved into memorial walls and taught to children for generations, was taken by a combat journalist embedded with the Terran Marines. It showed a young Marine, a private barely out of training, sitting in the ruins of a collapsed building. He was covered in dust, and there was blood on his armor from a fight that had ended minutes earlier. In his arms, he held a Zithari larva, a pale, squirming creature about the size of a human infant that had been trapped in the rubble. The Marine was cradling it against his chest, plate the way a father holds a newborn, one hand supporting its body and the other shielding its head from the dust still falling from the ceiling. His face in that photograph was the face of every human who has ever held a child, tender and fierce, and absolutely certain that no harm would come to the small life in his arms. The image spread across the galaxy in hours. The Velkari wept openly when they saw it. The Drethai, who respected strength above all things, declared that this single image proved humanity was the strongest species in the galaxy, not because they could destroy, but because they could destroy and choose not to. Admiral Torres addressed the Zathari civilian population through captured communication networks. His message was broadcast in every Zathari dialect, and it was simple and direct. He said that humanity was not here for their children. He said that humanity was not here for their workers or their builders or their caretakers. He said that humanity was here for those who gave the orders and those who carried them out. He said that humanity does not punish the innocent, and that this was the difference between them. The Zathari military collapsed in 3 weeks not because humanity destroyed it, but because it simply could not function against an enemy that was simultaneously merciless in combat and compassionate in victory. Zathari soldiers began surrendering in increasing numbers, not out of cowardice, but because word had spread through the ranks that the humans would treat prisoners with dignity, that they would feed them and heal their wounds and not harm their families. Warlord Chithrak, the architect of the attack on the Lullaby, was captured trying to flee into deep space aboard a stolen civilian transport. He had disguised himself as a worker caste Zathari, shedding his warrior markings in a desperate attempt to escape. He was found hiding in a cargo container, trembling, with none of the bravado he had displayed when he was striking children and laughing. He was brought before Admiral Torres in restraints. Torres looked at the creature that had ordered the beating of 1,200 children and said nothing for a long time. The silence stretched until Chithrak began to shift uncomfortably in his restraints. Finally, Torres spoke. He said that Chithrak would face justice, not human justice but galactic justice, because humanity wanted the entire galaxy to see what happened and to remember. The final act of the military campaign was the surrounding of overmined Sekrath's Hive Palace. The Zathari leader had refused to surrender even as his empire crumbled around him. He sat on his throne surrounded by his last loyal guards and waited for the humans to come and destroy him. Torres did not destroy him. Torres sent a single Marine squad into the palace. With orders to accept the overmined surrender, the squad walked through the empty halls of the vast structure, past abandoned guard posts and silent communication centers, until they reached the throne room. Sekrath looked at the humans standing before him, small, soft, mammalian creatures without claws or armor or venom, and something in his ancient compound eyes finally understood what every other species in the galaxy had been trying to tell him. He asked Torres one question through the communication link. He asked if humanity would really dismantle an entire civilization over a few bruised children. Torres leaned forward, and the galaxy heard his response, because every channel was broadcasting. He said that humanity would not destroy a civilization. He said that humanity would destroy a military machine and dismantle a government and rewrite a culture. He said that they were doing this because the Zathari thought children were acceptable casualties, and he said that humanity was making sure the galaxy never forgets what happens when someone makes that mistake. The Overmind lowered his head. The Zathari dominion fell, not through genocide, not through cruelty, not through the erasure of a species, but through the complete and surgical removal of every structure and institution and individual that had allowed violence against the defenseless. And the galaxy watched in silence, because there was nothing to say in the presence of something this absolute. 6 months after the guns went silent, the galaxy was learning how to breathe again. The Zathari dominion no longer existed, at least not in the form that had terrorized the fringes of civilized space for 3 centuries. The warrior caste that had ruled with absolute authority was gone, its leaders imprisoned, its military dissolved, its weapons destroyed. In its place there was something new and fragile and uncertain, a provisional government made up of Zethari civilians who had never been allowed to govern anything, supported by conquered advisors who were still trying to understand how to help a species rebuild itself from the inside out. And then there were the humans. Nobody in the galaxy had expected what happened after the war ended. Everyone had expected humanity to plant its flag and walk away, to leave the Zethari to pick up their own pieces, the way Victoria's species had always done throughout galactic history. Instead, the same warships that had shattered the Zethari fleet began delivering construction materials. The same Marines who had dismantled military bases began building schools. The galaxy could not quite wrap its collective mind around this detail. Humanity had just fought and won the most one-sided war in recorded history against a species that had beaten their children. And their first act after victory was to build schools for the children of their enemy. Human engineers arrived on Zethari colony worlds with blueprints and building equipment, and a determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. They did not ask the Zethari what they wanted. They asked the Zethari what they needed, and when the Zethari civilians, still stunned and frightened and waiting for the punishment that they were sure was coming, said that they needed nurseries and medical facilities and places where their young could grow safely, the humans nodded and got to work. Within 3 months, there were functioning hospitals on every major Zethari world staffed by human and Velkari medical teams. There were food distribution centers run by Drethi volunteers who handled the logistics with military precision. There were communication networks rebuilt from scratch so that Zethari families separated by the war could find each other again. And there were the schools. The schools were the thing that broke the Zethari. Not in the way the war had broken their military, but in a deeper way, in a way that reached into the core of what the Zethari believed about the galaxy and about themselves. The schools were built to Zethari specifications, with the right humidity and temperature, and lighting for insectoid physiology. But they were designed by human educators who understood something profound about children regardless of species. Every classroom had windows because human research showed that natural light improved learning. Every hallway was wide enough for Zethari young to move in groups, because humans understood that insectoid species felt safer in clusters. Every wall was left blank, not because the builders had run out of materials, but because humans knew that children needed to fill those walls themselves with their own art and their own stories and their own dreams. A Zethari elder visited one of the new schools in the capital city of the former Dominion. He walked through the bright corridors and looked at the small desks and the learning terminals and the play areas designed for young Zethari to climb and explore. He stood in the middle of a classroom for a long time without speaking, and then he turned to the human architect who had designed it and asked why. "Why would you do this for us?" he asked. "We hurt your children." The architect, a young woman from a city called Lagos who had traveled across the galaxy to build this place, looked at the elder and said something that would be quoted in Zethari histories for centuries to come. She said that they were doing this because children do not choose their parents, and they do not choose their governments, and they do not choose their wars. She said that every child in the galaxy deserves a chance to become something better than the world they were born into. She said that this was what humans believed, and that it was what they would always believe. The elder did not respond. He simply lowered his head in the Zethari gesture of deepest respect and walked away. On the other side of the galaxy, the GSS Lullaby had been repaired. It had taken 4 months to fix the damage that the Zethari soldiers had done. The hull breaches were sealed, and the systems were restored, and the corridors were cleaned and repainted. But Captain Alara Voss had insisted on one thing before the ship could return to service. The children who had been aboard during the attack would be the first to see it. They came back in small groups, accompanied by parents and counselors and teachers. Some of them were nervous, and some of them cried when they stepped through the airlocks and remembered what had happened in these hallways. But the ship had been transformed in subtle ways that only children would notice. The dormitories had new murals, painted by art students from Earth who had volunteered for the project. Showing scenes of different species playing together under alien suns, the reading rooms had new books in a dozen languages. The observation deck had been expanded, so that more children could press their faces against the glass and watch the stars go by. Mia Okonkwo came back. She was 6.5 years old now, and her arm had healed completely, though she still rubbed the spot sometimes when she was thinking. She walked through the corridors of the lullaby holding her mother's hand, and looking at everything with those wide, dark eyes that saw more than most adults realized. She stopped in front of the main assembly hall, the room where the worst of the attack had happened, and she looked at the door for a long time. Her mother knelt beside her and asked if she was okay. Mia nodded. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a piece of paper. She had drawn a picture with colored markers, her favorite medium because paint was too slow, and Mia had things to say that could not wait. The picture showed a tall figure in green armor, a Terran Marine. Holding something small and pale in its arms, the Marine had a big smile on its face, and the small thing in its arms had a smile too, even though it did not have a mouth exactly, because Mia had done her best to draw a Zithari larva, and she was 6, and artistic accuracy was not her primary concern. Captain Voss found the drawing taped to the door of the assembly hall later that day. She stood in the corridor and looked at it for a very long time, and then she carefully removed it and carried it to the bridge, and placed it in a frame, and hung it where she could see it from her command chair. It stayed there for the rest of the lullaby's service life. The trial of Warlord Chithrak and his soldiers took place at the Galactic Concord Tribunal 3 months after the war ended. It was not a human court. Humanity had specifically requested that the trial be conducted by a panel of judges representing every species in the Concord. They wanted the galaxy to see and to judge and to remember. Chithrak entered the tribunal chamber in restraints. He was smaller than anyone remembered. Or perhaps he had simply shrunk in the way that all bullies shrink when they are stripped of their power, and forced to stand in the light. His compound eyes darted around the chamber looking for sympathy and finding none. The evidence was presented methodically and thoroughly. 47 minutes of footage from the lullaby's internal cameras, medical reports documenting the injuries to the children, testimony from crew members and passengers, and the recording of Captain Voss telling Chithrak that he had made the last mistake his lineage would ever make. The defense, such as it was, argued that the Zithari had been acting within their cultural norms of military discipline, and that the children had not been seriously harmed. The tribunal judges listened to this argument, with expressions that ranged from disbelief to barely contained fury. The verdict was unanimous across all species representatives, guilty on every count. The sentence was carefully chosen to reflect not just human values, but galactic ones. Chithrak and every soldier who had participated in the attack were sentenced to permanent exile on a barren moon at the edge of known space. They would live out their natural lives, stripped of all rank and identity and connection to the species they had shamed. They would not be executed, because humanity did not believe in creating martyrs. They would simply be forgotten, erased from Zithari history, as if they had never existed. For a species that defined itself through its place in the swarm, there was no worse punishment. The Concord convened a special session 1 month after the trial. Every species sent their most senior representative, and the chamber was full in a way it had not been since the founding of the Concord itself. The Velkari ambassador, the same one whose child had been aboard the lullaby, rose and proposed an amendment to the Concord Charter. She said it had been co-written by every species in the Concord, and that it was being submitted for unanimous approval. The amendment passed without a single objection. It was carved into the stone walls of the Concord Hall in every known language. 347 scripts arranged in concentric circles around a central message that read, "Let this stand eternal. The young of all species are sacred, and should any power forget, ask the Zithari what became of those who harmed humanity's children." The carving was placed directly below Article 0, where every diplomat and leader and visitor to the conquered hall would see it for as long as the building stood. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways both large and small. The Zithari people, freed from their warrior caste, and given the opportunity to build something new, became one of the most active participants in the Conquered's educational programs. They sent their young to schools built by humans and staffed by teachers of a dozen species. And those young Zithari grew up knowing that the galaxy was bigger and more complicated and more beautiful than the Dominion had ever allowed them to believe. On a warm afternoon in the Drethai homeworld's most prestigious military academy, a warrior scholar named Vrek was teaching a class of mixed-species cadets about galactic history. The class included humans, Velkari, Drethai, Keshani. And for the first time in the Academy's history, 3 young Zithari who had been admitted on full scholarships funded by the Terran government. Vrek was discussing the events surrounding the answering when one of the Zithari students raised a clawed appendage. Her name was Sithara, and she was young and curious, and she had grown up in a world that was nothing like the Dominion her grandparents had known. She asked a question that had been bothering her for a long time. She said that she had studied humans extensively, and that she had lived among them during her preparation for the academy. She said that they were kind and generous and patient, and that they laughed easily and cried easily and hugged their children constantly, and worried about small things like whether their food was too spicy or their clothes were the right color. She said that none of this seemed frightening at all, and yet every species in the galaxy treated humans with a respect that bordered on reverence, not just political respect but something deeper, something almost like fear. Why, she asked, do all the other species fear humans when they seem so kind? The classroom went quiet. Every student turned to look at Vrek. The old Drethai warrior set down his teaching materials and regarded the young Zithari with eyes that had seen battles and peace, and everything in between his mandibles clicked slowly, a Drethai expression that meant he was choosing his words with great care. He said that she was right, that humans were kind. He said that they were among the kindest species the galaxy had ever produced. He said that their kindness was not a weakness or a performance, but a genuine expression of what they were at their core. Then he paused, and the room felt the weight of what was coming. He said that humans were kind because they chose to be kind every single day. He said that this was the part most species did not understand. It was not natural for humans, the way swimming is natural for a Velkari or fighting is natural for a Drethai. Humans had to choose kindness over the alternative, and they made that choice constantly, moment by moment, generation after generation, against every instinct that their violent evolutionary history had given them. And that, he said, was what should terrify everyone, because a species that is kind by nature can only ever be kind, but a species that is kind by choice can stop choosing at any moment. And when humans stop choosing kindness, when someone forces them to stop, what remains is something the galaxy prays it will never see again. He looked at Sithara, and his voice softened, and he said that the humans were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, precisely because they were kind, because their kindness was a dam holding back an ocean, and the Zithari had been foolish enough to crack it. Sithara was quiet for a moment, then she nodded slowly and said that she understood. Vrek smiled, or at least made the Drethai expression that was closest to a smile, and said that he was glad and that understanding this was the first step toward making sure no one ever had to learn the lesson again. Far away, at the edge of explored space, the GSS Lullaby departed from port on a bright morning with a new class of children aboard. The ship gleamed in the starlight, freshly painted and fully repaired, with the name Lullaby written across its hull in letters that caught the light and scattered it like a promise. The passenger manifest listed children from 14 different species: human, Velkari, Drethai, Keshani, Aurelian, and many more, and for the first time, there were Zithari young among them. 7 larvae who had been enrolled by parents who wanted their children to see the galaxy the way it was meant to be seen. Captain Alara Voss stood on the bridge and looked at the stars through the forward viewport. She was older now and a little more gray, and the lines around her eyes were deeper than they had been a year ago, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear. And on the wall behind her command chair, in a simple frame, hung a drawing made by a 6-year-old girl, a picture of a Marine holding a baby with a smile that said everything words could not. Voss turned to her crew and told them it was time to go. The lullaby moved forward into the dark, and the stars welcomed it like old friends, and somewhere in the dormitories below the bridge, children of a dozen different species were already laughing together, as if the universe was exactly the wonderful place it was supposed to be. And the galaxy remembered. The galaxy always remembered.